It's Veritas Forum with Dr. Craig Johnson, professor in residence of Chalcedon Christian Academy and pastor of Bethel Christian Fellowship in Agora Hills.
Welcome to Veritas Forum. My name is Craig Johnson. My special guest is James Patrick Holding. He's the president of Tecton Apologetics, author of Shattering the Christ Myth, and a new book on the reliability of the New Testament documents. Welcome, JP.
Oh, thank you, Craig.
We're going to talk about the historicity of the New Testament, the reliability of the New Testament documents. Christians have written many books on the topic. You have a new one. Tell us about it.
I'm working on it right now, and it has a working title of Trusting the New Testament. I'm going to be checking on that to see what I want to do with that title. I'm going to look at four basic aspects that have to do with the transmission of the New Testament, whether it was handed down to us reliably. I'm going to look at four aspects. I'm going to look at oral tradition, whether the word of mouth transmission was accurate. I'm going to look at the textual transmission of the New Testament, whether it was copied accurately down to our time. I'm going to look at the authorship of the New Testament documents, whether they were authentically by the persons whose names are on them. And I'm going to look at the formation of the canon.
Now, I just came back from Europe and was dealing with some atheists that I had met, and they are making claims such as there is not a shred of evidence that Jesus lived historically. There's not a shred of evidence that the four Gospels are primary source documents from the time of Jesus. They're all written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, and Christians have always had a presentation that the four Gospels are historically reliable. The manuscripts are in a good condition, therefore we can trust the information they give us. Where do we stand in that debate now?
Well, we stand in very good stead with all four of those issues that I mentioned. And the one in particular that is most brought up these days, I think, is the textual transmission aspect. I have heard so many people claim that the New Testament was gradually altered over time, that it originally didn't say that Jesus was divine or the Son of God, and it was entirely different when it was originally written, and that some evil people over time changed it, or maybe the Emperor Constantine changed it, or they'll have any number of people they'll say changed it. But the bottom line is they think that we've been sold a bill of goods with the New Testament, and that it's not what it originally said as far as what we have now.
Where do we stand with regard to the historicity and the quality and the reliability of the four Gospels?
Okay. In terms of the transmission aspect, or the
Yes.
Okay. In terms of the transmission aspect, and this is for the entire New Testament, not just for the four Gospels, if you do a comparison with secular documents, we are so far ahead, it's shameful, okay? And this is one of the critical issues. When a lot of these atheists, like the ones you talked to, and you need some better friends, by the way, okay? A lot of these people you talk to, they will never do comparative statistics on other documents, okay? And I've looked into the literature by textual critics of secular documents, people who study like the works of Homer, or the works of Tacitus, the Roman historian, or the works of Josephus, the Jewish historian. They would love to have the wealth of evidence textually that we have for the New Testament. I think the most recent statistic was something like 5,600 copies in Greek alone of the New Testament, okay? The earliest one dating a little scrap of the Gospel of John to about 125 AD. Now, some of your atheist friends will say, well, that's 100 years. That's a lot of time for changes to be made, right? But again, do the comparison. How many copies do we have of some of these other documents, and how early are they? I like to use the Annals of Tacitus as a comparison. It's not the best example. It's not the ancient document with a large number of copies. But because Tacitus is considered the most reliable ancient historian, I like to use him as an example. How many copies of Tacitus' Annals do you suppose we have from ancient times? We have about 5,600 in Greek of the New Testament. Care to take a guess how many we have of Tacitus' Annals?
I don't know.
How's this?
3.
3 copies of the Annals of Tacitus. And how old do you think they are compared to that 125 AD for the New Testament first scrap, and then we have whole copies dating to like 200 years later? What do you think is the earliest copy we have of Tacitus' Annals?
I don't know.
How about the 11th century?
My goodness.
Keeping in mind that Tacitus wrote in the 2nd century, like about 115, 125 AD.
That's a long time.
That's a long time.
And in the classics department, you're not going to see them throwing him out the window.
Exactly. That is the point I wish to make. The secular textual scholars are not in a panic over these things. Now, they will say things like, yeah, it's kind of hard to figure out. We may not ever be sure exactly what was said over here or over there. But they're still working at the colleges. They haven't quit their jobs to become dishwashers. which is what some of these atheists apparently want us to do with the New Testament. Now, one of the things that these atheists will say when you point this kind of thing out to them, because they can't answer it, of course, is they'll say, well, no one says that the works of Tacitus are inerrant or inspired. Well, that's beside the point. That's completely beside the point. The evidence is still much better for the Bible, for the New Testament. Now, even if it's not inspired or inerrant or what have you, you still have a historical record to deal with. And on that basis, you still need to make the comparisons, and you're still going to have to admit that the New Testament is in better shape textually.
So they used to call this the bibliographical test, the amount of manuscripts that we have and the interval from the original to the extant copy. Then the internal test was, does the document claim to be what it appears to be? Then the external test said, is there other information outside the document that confirms that internal testimony? Where do we stand in that three-pronged argument?
Now you're getting into authorship now, and I want to explain one quick thing before we go further on the textual part, because this is something some of these atheists will do too. They'll put up this straw man. They'll say that in us saying that there are so many copies of the New Testament, that we are thereby arguing that you can trust that the events recorded in it happened. That is not what we're doing, okay? That's two separate issues. All we're talking about is how reliably it was copied over time. They'll try and mix it together and say we're claiming something. We're not about that. That's not what we're doing. But now you're talking about authorship. And in the book that I'm writing right now, I'm discussing three different aspects of making a case for who authored an ancient document. Again, my issue here is comparative, okay? Let's just start with the modern book as an example, okay? I've mentioned this book in another presentation we did. This is one of the books by the people who believe Jesus didn't exist. This is The Jesus Mysteries by Timothy Freke and Peter Gandy. Now, how do we know that this was authored by Timothy Freke and Peter Gandy? Says so right here, doesn't it? Well, strange as that is, this is the first test for deciding who authored a document, ancient or modern. What does it say on the document itself? Okay, that's one of our first tests. Now, admittedly, there are some documents, such as the Gospel of Thomas, which are not by Thomas, that have Thomas's name on it. So this test does not stand by itself, but it is the first burden upon anyone who would doubt the authorship of a book. Now, if we found a copy of this book and it said Craig Johnson on it, okay, let's say we found a secret warehouse with a bunch of copies that said Craig Johnson on there, then maybe we could say, well, maybe this is questionable that Freke and Gandy wrote it, okay? That's what we need for the New Testament. Maybe a copy of Luke's Gospel that said Peter on it or something like that. But that's not what we find. Now, in terms of the Annals of Tacitus, which again I like to use as a comparison, we have Tacitus' name at the very beginning of those copies where we have the beginning, okay? And that's all we have. His name appears at the beginning. It doesn't appear anywhere else inside the text. So if you're going to be fair and judge the Annals and the New Testament documents by the same criteria, you'd have to say, on this point of internal attestation, whose name is on it, the New Testament's in far better shape. Now, I want to make a point of this, too. 27 New Testament books, okay? Hebrews is anonymous. That leaves 26. How many of those books do you suppose are regularly questioned by critics of Christianity in terms of their authorship? Do you know how many?
I don't know.
14 of them, okay? 14 out of 26 books are regularly attacked in terms of saying we don't know who actually wrote it. Paul's name is fake on there. Matthew's name is fake. Even Mark and Luke are sometimes attacked that way. Mostly 14 of those books. That's over half the New Testament. So this is obviously a significant issue. Now, the other criteria you mentioned as well, external attestation. Here's what this would be about. Let's say that we had a book review source like Publishers Weekly, and they say this book, The Jesus Mysteries, was written by Peter Freke, Timothy Freke, maybe they're both freaks, and Peter Gandy. Okay? That's someone from the outside saying who wrote it. Their publisher says they wrote it. Other reporters say they wrote it. Someone outside affirms the authorship. Now, when it comes to the New Testament, we have church fathers, early church writers from the 2nd and 3rd century. They are quite clear on the documents of the New Testament being written by whose name is on them. Now, there was some discussion, and we can talk about that in another issue, over some books like 2nd Peter and John, the 2nd and 3rd John. But they eventually decided that, yes, this is who wrote them. So if we, again, go by the standard, the New Testament is treated fairly, then the external attestation is sound. For the Annals of Tacitus, I went looking for evidence that someone said, yes, Tacitus wrote the Annals. I could not find anything very early. I was able to find something from one of the early church fathers about 400 years later, where he said, well, Tacitus wrote these certain number of books about the history of Rome, and that happened to fit the description of the Annals along with one of his other sets of books called the Histories. So I counted that as the earliest attestation from an external source. The New Testament is superior in that respect because it has earlier external attestations and many more than the Annals of Tacitus.
So what would your argument in favor of the historicity and reliability of the New Testament, how would it go if you were doing sermon points or lecture points in a presentation?
Well, if I had to, I've compressed these things into into lessons, and I would start with that authorship issue. I would start with the textual reliability issue. Those are the two main points I would make in lessons, because those, without that as a basis, you have no reason to even ask, did Jesus rise from the dead? Did Jesus really feed 5,000 people? Unless you can be sure it was transmitted to you correctly, you don't even start asking, did this actually happen?
Now, we mentioned the trilemma used to be Jesus is Lord, liar, or lunatic. He was Lord, he is who he said he was. He's a liar, he knew it was false, but he propagated it. He's nuts. But the fourth L is legend. People nowadays are denying wholesale the historicity of Jesus by denying the reliability of the documents. This is an important issue, isn't it?
Absolutely a very important issue. Absolutely. It's something we need to be really concerned about. And I want to mention, too, one other criteria I talked about for authorship, and that's the internal evidence of style and content. Okay? So you want to talk about that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sure.
Now, here's the example I like to use, and again, I'll use Tacitus since I like that guy a whole lot. He was a real funny guy sometimes. He got right to the point, much like we do, you know. Let's say you were reading the Annals, and it said in there that the Emperor Nero opened his refrigerator, took out a burrito, and put it in his microwave oven. Now, what would tell you that that was not written by Tacitus, the Roman historian?
Little anachronistic.
A little anachronistic, isn't it? Well, they didn't have refrigerators, didn't have burritos. They had microwaves, but nowhere to plug them in, you know? So this is the kind of thing that people look for in documents to decide whether or not they were written by the person whose name are on them. You look at the kind of person who was alleged to have written the document. Tacitus was a government official. So what would we expect him to be like when he writes? Well, we'd expect he'd be kind of upper crust, you know? Expect him to have a bit of an attitude towards lower class people, which he does. We'd expect him to get governmental terms right, but maybe not farming terms or something outside his field. We would look at that kind of thing inside the document, and we would say, does this sound like that kind of person? Okay. Now let me issue a caveat on that, all right? This kind of criteria is not always sound if you're just going to apply it flatly. You have to be very cautious in applying it. Now, as you've said, I do Christian apologetics, right? Would you believe I also draw cartoons?
I've seen them.
You've seen them, but would you believe it otherwise? Would you ordinarily think, well, someone who...
An egghead who's got a sense of humor.
Yeah. You know, this egghead who reads all these books by New Testament scholars also draws stuff that looks like Bugs Bunny. You wouldn't think so. That's where you need to have some caution with this whole thing of style, you know, because there are perfectly capable people who can be different things at different times. Paul especially shows every evidence of having been very highly educated. And there's another related issue, which is that, especially with letters like Paul's, often someone would hire or use the services of a scribe to write letters for them, because writing was such a laborious process in that time. You know, it's not like you go down to Office Depot and buy a few sheets of paper, get out your ballpoint pen, and start scribbling, right? It was a very laborious process. You're constantly dipping into the ink with your nib, and the scroll is hard to write on. And you know, this is kind of strange. It would be very strange. Would you believe that they had no idea about using a desk to write on? They didn't. They even though they had tables and things like that, no one ever thought, you know, gee, I could just put my writing over here and write. They wrote on their knee or on their thigh, and you know, things like that. It was very difficult, back-breaking, terrible. And it was so slow, too. So if you hired someone to write for you, you could save yourself a lot of time and trouble. You could just dictate to them. You could say, I want you to write exactly this. Or Paul could say, I want you to write to the Galatians about this and this, and then whoever, Timothy, would write it up however he thought it should be written, and bring it to Paul and say, what do you like? What do you like about this? Paul would say, that looks good. Sign off on it. And so different styles in letters of Paul or someone else like that could be an indication of a scribe. And it would still be credited to Paul, even if it was written, actually handwritten by someone like Timothy. I happen to think, for example, the pastoral letters were authored by Luke at Paul's behest.
Now, when people in our culture say, I'm holding the New Testament in my hands, I look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is this, as the Jesus Seminar people would suggest, is this the later faith experience of the church read into documents that are very late? Or are we dealing with primary source material when we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
Now, certainly that's what we would hold, is that it is primary source material, or in the case of someone like Mark or Luke, they talked to people who were primary sources and collected it in one spot for us. Naturally, someone like the Seminar, and they're just one critic out of many who would say this, and they're certainly not the earliest nor the last, will have to say that this somehow reflects a subjective faith experience, and that history was thereafter made up, rewritten in order to reflect this faith experience. We know Jesus rose from the dead not because we met him in person, but because it says so in here. And therefore, we know that's why he rose from the dead, not because we met him as the risen Jesus, but because something in here tells us. Basically, the Mormon internal witness.
But we need to have facts. It's fact, faith, and feeling. I remember that little choo-choo train.
Yes.
First get the facts, then have faith in the facts, then the feelings follow.
That's right.
Now, with regard to your presentation of the reliability of the New Testament documents, what is it that you're saying to the critics of our time?
I'm saying that we have those facts, that we have that engine right in front of us, and that it's got a lot of steam. And you're going to have to explain it away if you're going to tell us we're wrong.
Now, on Tecton Apologetics, your website, your book Shattering the Christ Myth, your new book on the reliability of the New Testament documents, do you put this material in such a way that it's accessible to everybody?
Yeah, that is what I've been trying to do with these books. In some cases it's technical, but I do try and make the points as accessible as possible throughout.
What are the critics saying now? What is their chief point of attack with regard to the reliability of the New Testament?
These days, I think the textual criticism issue is the main thing, and what has made it most accessible these days is the work of a fellow named Bart Ehrman. Now, Bart Ehrman is a textual scholar. He is a very proficient scholar. I'm not going to take a thing away from him. But he used to be a fundamentalist Christian and now professes to be an agnostic. And one of the reasons he became one, he says, is because he couldn't believe the New Testament anymore. And he raises these issues in a book called Misquoting Jesus, in which he says, well, basically, this has been distorted and we can't be sure what was said. Now, what I'll tell you is that there's another scholar named Daniel Wallace who is every bit as proficient in this field as Ehrman is. And he is saying that Ehrman is taking this black and white mentality that he had as a fundamentalist and applying it to the New Testament scriptures. If we can't be sure of one thing, we can't be sure of any of it. That's not how the secular textual critics do business. That's Ehrman applying his former mindset.
A black and white
a
faulty
black and
dilemma.
Yes.
Yeah, no gray scale.
No grayscale, precisely.
So, tell us a little more about Ehrman's book. What is he saying?
Well, he will point to various problems in the New Testament, which are actually old news in many cases, and use that as a basis for people to say, well, let's be more concerned. I like to compare him to Chicken Little. He presses the button, the panic button, constantly, saying, because of this little problem, we can't be sure of much more. Now, I'll give you just a couple of examples. Mark 16, 9 through 20. Now, you open your average study Bible, and you will often find a note that says, this is not original to Mark. We know Mark did not write this. Correct? You've seen that? He will bring this up in his book as though no one knew it before, as though this is some surprising news. It isn't. We've been well aware of this for a long time. Same thing with the story of the woman caught in adultery, John 8. Most of your study Bibles will have a note about that. Or here's another example of what he'll do. I like this one in particular. In Mark 1:41, Jesus heals a leper. Okay, we're familiar with that story? Okay, and it says one of two things. It either says that he was having compassion on the man, or it says he was angry with the man. Now here's the thing. The evidence indicates that Mark originally wrote angry. I'll explain why shortly. But what Ehrman will say is, well, obviously someone was ashamed of the fact that Jesus was mad at this poor leper, and so they changed it to say compassion Okay, and he will say there was some theological issue with this, like they were trying to cover up some deficiency in Jesus. Okay, now I'll explain why that is not a theological problem at all. Jesus is angry many times in the New Testament. Cleaned out that temple pretty heavy, didn't he? Mm-hmm. Okay, he's angry at other times in Mark as well, at least a couple of other times. Christians had no shame over Jesus being angry. They didn't see that as a problem. Okay. In this case in particular, Ehrman plays on this sympathy we would naturally have for the leper to say, well, obviously they were covering something up, right? Consider this. Now, what was leprosy in the New Testament period? Probably not Hansen's disease, but it could be even just a small spot on your skin. That word we use for leprosy covered a wide variety of skin diseases. So this guy wasn't necessarily suffering a great deal. In fact, he probably wasn't, because if he came in front of that crowd and wasn't chased off, probably his leprosy wasn't that obvious, okay? Now, second thing, Jesus is teaching in the synagogue, right? Okay? And this man comes up to him right in the middle of his teaching. What's he just done? We call that putting him on Front Street, don't we? Okay? He has basically challenged Jesus in front of all these people and forced him to do this healing in front of everybody. Because if he doesn't do it, then it's in front of everybody. Looks like a problem, right? Looks like, oh, you can't do it, right? Now, because he did this, he forced Jesus' hand. Jesus had every right to be angry with the man for doing that to him, okay? Just like if put you on Front Street today, you'd be angry at a man, right? For doing something like that. And then add insult to injury. When Jesus touches that leper, what's everyone else going to think of him? They're going to think he's unclean. And you notice right after that story, Jesus had to get out of Dodge, right? So his ministry was hampered in that town because this guy insisted on healing in front of everybody. It's kind of like if you're preaching and I come up to you and spray orange paint all over you, right? You're not going to be preaching with orange paint all over you. Maybe your youth pastor would, I don't know. But either way, you see, Ehrman is wrong in saying that there's no reason for Jesus to be angry and therefore Christians must have been covering it up.
But as you're pointing out, all the books, the Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, When Critics Ask by Norman Geisler, these are not new issues.
No.
There are responses to every one of them. What is this about the critics and even technical scholars who are presenting this stuff as though it's brand new?
There must be some motivation behind it. They're trying to convince others that what they say is true. You know, Ehrman wrote a book for scholars called The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, in which he says many of the same things in more detail that he says in Misquoting Jesus. Wallace noticed that in many cases he did not report some mitigating facts about his claims in Misquoting Jesus that were reported in Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. So clearly, Ehrman is trying to get over to a popular audience certain points he wants to make that he wouldn't try to get over to scholars in his own
This
field.
brings me to the point of sometimes it's not about what it's about. Sometimes a technical scholar can be brilliant in their technical skills, but if their heart is wrong, if their perception is wrong, depending on their personality temperament, the axe they have to grind, what do you run into when you're dealing with Tecton.org, when you're dealing online with skeptics and critics? Is there a mindset, a skeptical or critical mindset, which stands apart from the scholarly apparatus?
Well, there certainly is. In many cases, what we have are people who think they know more than they do. And they've just read a couple of things off Wikipedia, the abomination that causes misinformation, and they think they've got the whole story, or they are satisfied with what they found on Wikipedia, and so they look no further. They would never pick up a book by Daniel Wallace. They might pick up Ehrman's book because they know it agrees with what they want to hear. But they would never pick up any other book, or they would just briefly look at it and claim it doesn't answer the question. And what you said it's an issue of the heart, okay? I do not, purposely, I will not try and judge someone's heart motives unless they make it very obvious. I will start out by judging what their head produces. I will judge the facts and the arguments they present. And if after a certain time they repeatedly say, well, that doesn't make sense, or they will not answer the argument, or they'll make up some excuse that is not grounded in scholarship, then I think the evidence will speak for itself that there's a heart issue there as well as a head issue, or that the heart issue is the primary one.
James Patrick Holding, he's the author of Shattering the Christ Myth, the author of a brand new book on the reliability of the New Testament documents, the author of Mormon Defenders, the author of The Impossible Faith, and the internet presence on Tecton Apologetics. Which book has your passion right now?
The book on New Testament reliability has right now, because it is the one I'm working on directly. If the schedule goes right, it should be out sometime in March or April of 2009. I just started working on some of the final chapters this past week.
If people want to contact you, they can go to your website?
They can.
How would they get there?
That will be at tectonics.org, TEKTONICS.org.
And there's a lot of information on that site.
Yeah, I have
Bring your coffee.
Yeah, about 1,500 articles. You know, if you count, like some articles are very short, others are very long, but if you count them all separately, you get about 1,500, I think.
One more quick point. What is the opinion you're held in the skeptical community? Are you did you strike fear into the hearts of men and women?
Maybe. What you'll find is that I'm a dirty, rotten scoundrel. I'm nasty. I eat babies. I kick dogs and boil puppies in boiling water and things like that. Only on weekends do I do that.
Of course.
No.
You're a busy man. Well, you know, I'm so grateful to have you on this program. We're going to be doing more programs together.
Yes.
It's so important that we get this information from the top shelf to the bottom shelf, the hay out of the loft onto the barn floor where the cows can get to it. And I'm so appreciative of your ministry, JP. It's been a great blessing in my life and in the lives of so many people, and especially young people who are our future. They need to be aware of these issues. But going into high school, going into college especially, they need to be able to defend the faith once delivered to the saints, and you're on a cutting edge here. So we appreciate all of your hard work.
The earlier the better. You know, a friend of mine said this just a couple of days ago, you can't just assume because they were baptized at 6 that they're going to be safe. You know, there's a lot more they're going to run into out there.
And even in the Christian community, we're not doing a job, are we, in preparing our young people so often.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much again for being our guest.
Thank you, Craig.
See you next time on the Veritas Forum.